Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the second in a series of lectures on MacIntyre's dependent rational animals. In this lecture, we will be covering chapter 1, which deals with vulnerability. In the first lecture, we set up the book and put it in context of MacIntyre's overall work. Uh, what we will be doing now is looking at the particular arguments of chapter 1. And chapter 1 really is about vulnerability, and this is a topic, as I said in the first lecture, that philosophers have basically ignored, except for feminists in the last 20th century. And if you look at page 3 of the book, you'll see he has a wonderful list there. Of course, the list is stated, it's from 1999, but of feminists who have addressed vulnerability and disability in the 20th century. And much more work has been done since 1999 on these issues, and I encourage you to look at those works on your own time. The two questions that come up with vulnerability are, what changes if we make vulnerability and dependence central to the human condition? And so, as you see from the pictures on the left side of the screen, we are vulnerable at various stages in our lives. When we are infants, certainly in old age, and we may be disabled for many periods of time. It might be because we've become homeless, we've become refugees from climate change, from other environmental disasters such as hurricanes, from political revolutions, or we may just be injured in a car wreck or some other injury that we sustain through work. So vulnerability characterizes human life, and yet philosophers have ignored it. So what changes if we begin to understand vulnerability and dependence as central to the human condition? And then how do we answer that question? How do we go about answering that kind of question? And so MacIntyre's approach is going to be to answer that question by understanding our relationship to non-human animals, to frame what it is for us to address the moral and political life through the lens of vulnerability. Now, interestingly, MacIntyre begins by talking about our bodies. And he writes on page 4 that consider how both physical and mental disability are afflictions of the body, and how therefore habits of mind that express an attitude of denial towards the facts of disability and dependence presuppose either a failure of a refusal to acknowledge adequately the body of our existence. And I think it's important here to recognize the body as central to human identity and central to our mental disabilities and afflictions that we might suffer, but also central to our mental abilities and powers. And it's unfortunate that MacIntyre does not keep the focus on the body throughout this text, and this is one of the criticisms that I will make towards the end of these lectures. But just at the very beginning, he enters into this discussion of vulnerability through a discussion of the human body, and something certainly that we share with the non-human animal world, right? We are animals, which means that we have these animal bodies. So he states his thesis on page 5. The virtues we need if we are to develop from our initial animal condition into that of independent rational agents, and the virtues that we need if we are to confront and respond to vulnerability and disability, both in ourselves and in others, belong to one and the same set of virtues, the distinctive virtues of dependent rational animals, whose dependence, rationality, and animality have to be understood in relation to each other. So he asked, what happens if we take vulnerability as central to human life? And he says the way that we have to answer that question is to see how dependence, rationality, and animality are to be understood in relationship to each other. And so the first part of this book, as I said in the preface, is going to address that relationship. How does dependence, rationality, and animality relate to each other for us human animals, and particularly in relationship to the non-human animal world? And certainly the body has a role to play there. And when we talk about disability and vulnerability, we are talking about bodies, but there's much more to say about vulnerability and disability as bodily uh, aspects of our lives that is left out in some of this conversation. However, what we're looking at is this relationship between dependence, rationality, and animality. And so MacIntyre proposes some initial problems to think about when we look at these questions. How is the phronesis of non-human animals related to human rationality? So phronesis is this Greek word. It means practical rationality, practical wisdom. So don't let that word throw you. I'll use phronesis and practical rationality interchangeably throughout this discussion. Uh, and so the question becomes, how does that phronesis of the non-human animal relate to the phronesis of the human animal, right? And so it's important to remember that we don't just have bodies. We are not ghosts inhabiting this body. We are, in important ways, our bodies, okay? Second, Aristotle didn't consider the facts of affliction or dependence in his discussions of ethics and of politics, right? And so he particularly left out discussions of women slaves and servants for any kind of consideration. And so that's something that we have to address if we are going to continue to develop a Thomistic Aristotelianism. Instead, what Aristotle accepted were a set of masculine virtues, particularly centered around self-sufficiency. And so, towards the end of the book, we'll bring into question self-sufficiency as a problem that we have to address, because human beings aren't self-sufficient in any of the ways that Aristotle certainly conceived of us as, and certainly not self-sufficient in the American way of pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. So, in many ways, dependent rational animals is a challenge both to Aristotle and to particularly Western liberal ideas of self-sufficiency, especially the kind that you find in American exceptionalism. So MacIntyre is proposing three theses that he's going to address throughout the book. First, our resemblance to and commonality with non-human animals. Part of his argument is that we cannot separate ourselves as human animals entirely from the non-human animal world, and he will emphasize this particularly in the first half of the book. And second, that our human identity is primarily, even if not only bodily and thus animal. And again, we'll see that emphasized through the first half of the book and underlying much of the discussion in the second half. Second thesis, virtues of independence go hand in hand with virtues of acknowledged dependence. And we're familiar with, even though we don't call them that, with the virtues of independence. So bravery and phronesis and other sorts of virtues. So what MacIntyre is going to bring in for us are virtues of acknowledged dependence. And finally, the modern nation state and the modern family cannot provide uh, the structures needed to develop the virtues. And so we're going to critique the modern nation state and the modern family through in part of this book and think about other ways of structuring our political lives. Okay, so those are the theses that we will be introduced to. Certainly the first thesis is one that we will cover in the first 60 pages of the book. The second thesis will be covered in the second half of the book, and then the third thesis in the last, not even third, of the book. And if you want to know the relationship between those aspects of the book, I invite you to go back to the preface to my first lecture overviewing MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals. Thank you.